orchestra, and a recent reconstruction of the original version of the Glagolitic Mass, which is even more fiery and dramatic.
Deceit, Desire, in the novel by Rene, Girard. Chapter 1, Triangular Desire. I want you to know, Sancho, that the famous Amadis of Gaul was one of the most perfect knight-errants. But what am I saying, one of the most perfect? I should say the only, the first, the unique, the master and lord of all those who existed in the world. I think that when a painter wants to become famous for his art, he tries to imitate the originals of the best masters he knows. The same rule applies to most important jobs or exercises which contribute to the embellishment of republics. Thus, the man who wishes to be known as careful and patient should and does imitate Ulysses, in whose person and works Homer paints for us a vivid portrait of carefulness and patience, just as Virgil shows us in the person of Aeneas the valor of a pious son and the wisdom of a valiant captain.
To a London radio station, Radio Free Czechoslovakia.
And it is understood that they depict them not as they are, but as they should be, to provide an example of virtue for centuries to come. In the same way, Amadis was the pole, the star, the sun for brave and amorous knights. And we others who fight under the banner of love and chivalry should imitate him. Thus, my friend Sancho, I reckon that whoever imitates him best will come closest to perfect chivalry. Don Quixote has surrendered to Amadis the individual's fundamental prerogative. He no longer chooses the objects of his own desire. Amadis must choose for him. The disciple pursues objects which are determined for him, or at least seem to be determined for him by the model of all chivalry. We shall call this model the mediator of desire. Chivalric existence is the imitation of Amadis in the same sense that the Christian's existence is the imitation of Christ. In most works of fiction, the characters have desires which are simpler than Don Quixote's. There is no mediator, there is only the subject and the object. When the nature of the object inspiring the passion is not sufficient to account for the desire, one must turn to the impassioned subject. Either his psychology is examined or his liberty invoked. But desire is always spontaneous. It can always be portrayed by a simple straight line which joins subject and object. The straight line is present in the desire of Don Quixote, but it is not essential. The mediator is there above that line, radiating toward both the subject and the object. The spatial metaphor which expresses this triple relationship is obviously the triangle. The object changes with each adventure, but the triangle remains. The barber's basin or Master Peter's puppets replace the windmills. But Amadis is always present. The triangle is no gestalt. The real structures are intersubjective. They cannot be localized anywhere. The triangle has no reality whatever. It is a systematic metaphor, systematically pursued. Because changes in size and shape do not destroy the identity of this figure, as we will see later, the diversity as well as the unity of the works can be simultaneously illustrated. The purpose and limitations of this structural geometry may become clearer through a reference to, quote, structural models, end of quote. The triangle is a model of a sort, or rather a whole family of models. But these models are not mechanical like those of Claude Levi-Strauss. They always allude to the mystery, transparent yet opaque, of human relations. All types of structural thinking assume that human reality is intelligible. It is a logos, and as such, it is an incipient logic, or it degrades itself into a logic. It can thus be systematized, at least up to a point, however unsystematic, irrational, and chaotic it may appear, even to those, or rather especially to those who operate the system. A basic contention of this essay is that the great writers apprehend intuitively and concretely, through the medium of their art, if not formally, the system in which they were first imprisoned together with their contemporaries. Literary interpretation must be systematic because it is the continuation of literature. It should formalize implicit or already half-explicit systems. To maintain that criticism will never be systematic. To maintain that criticism will never be systematic is to maintain that it will never be real knowledge. The value of a critical thought depends not on how cleverly it manages to disguise its own systematic nature, or on how many fundamental issues it manages to shirk or to dissolve, but on how much literary substance it really embraces, comprehends, and makes articulate. The goal may be too ambitious, but it is not outside the scope of literary criticism. It is the very essence of literary criticism. Failure to reach it should be condemned, but not the attempt. Everything else has already been done. Don Quixote in Cervantes' novel is a typical example of the victim of triangular desire, but he is far from being the only one. Next to him, the most affected is his squire, Sancho Panza. Some of Sancho's desires are not imitated, for example, those aroused by the light of a piece of cheese or a goatskin of wine. But Sancho has other ambitions besides filling his stomach. Ever since he has been with Don Quixote, he has been dreaming of an island of which he would be governor. And he wants the title of Duchess for his daughter. These desires do not come spontaneously to a simple man like Sancho. It is Don Quixote who has put them into his head. This time the suggestion is not literary but oral. But the difference has little importance. These new desires form a new triangle of which the imaginary island, Don Quixote, and Sancho occupy the angles. Don Quixote is Sancho's mediator. The effects of triangular desire are the same in the two characters. From the moment the mediator's influence is felt, the sense of reality is lost and judgment paralyzed. Since the mediator's influence is more profound and constant in the case of Don Quixote than in that of Sancho, romantic readers have seen in the novel little more than the contrast between Don Quixote, the idealist, and the realist Sancho. This contrast is real but secondary. It should not make us overlook the analogies between the two characters. Chivalric passion defines a desire according to another. Opposed to this desire according to oneself that most of us pride ourselves on enjoying. Don Quixote and Sancho borrow their desires from the other in a movement which is so fundamental and primitive that they completely confuse it with the will to be oneself. One might object that Amadis is a fictitious person, and this we must admit, but Don Quixote is not the author of this fiction. The mediator is imaginary, but not the mediation. Behind the hero's desires, there is indeed the suggestion of a third person. The inventor of Amadis, the author of the chivalric romances. Cervantes' work is a long meditation on the baleful influence that the most lucid minds can exercise upon one another. Except in the realm of chivalry, Don Quixote reasons with a great deal of common sense. Nor are his favorite writers mad. Perhaps they do not even take their fiction seriously. The illusion is the fruit of a bizarre marriage of two lucid consciousnesses. Chivalric literature, ever more widespread since the invention of the printing press, multiplies stupendously the chances of similar unions. Desire, according to the other, and the seminal function of literature are also found in the novels of Flaubert. Emma Bovary desires through the romantic heroines who fill her imagination. The second-rate books which she devoured in her youth have destroyed all her spontaneity. We must turn to Jules de Gaultier for the definition of this bovary-ism, which he reveals in almost every one of his Flaubert's characters. Quote, the same ignorance, the same inconsistency, the same absence of individual reaction seem to make them fated to obey the suggestion of an external milieu for lack of an auto-suggestion from within. In his famous essay entitled Bovary-ism, Gautier goes on to observe that in order to reach their goal, which is to, quote, see themselves as they are not, end of quote, Flaubert's heroes find a model for themselves and imitate from the person they have decided to be. All that can be imitated, everything exterior, appearance, gesture, intonation, and dress. The external aspects of imitation are the most striking. But we must above all remember that the characters of Cervantes and Flaubert are imitating, or believe they are imitating, the desires of models they have freely chosen. A third novelist, Stendhal, also underscores the role of suggestion and imitation in the personality of his heroes. Mathilde de la Mole finds her models in the history of her family. Julien Sorel imitates Napoleon. The memoirs of Saint Helena and the bulletins of the Grand Army replace the tales of chivalry and the romantic extravagances. The Prince of Parma imitates Louis XIV. The young Bishop of Agde practices the benediction in front of a mirror. He mimics the old and venerable prelates whom he fears he does not sufficiently resemble. Here, history is nothing but a kind of literature. It suggests to all Stendhal's characters feelings and especially desires that they do not experience spontaneously. When he enters the service of the Rene family, Julien borrows from Rousseau's Confessions the desire to eat at his master's table rather than that of his servants. Stendhal uses the word, quote, vanity, end of quote, to indicate all these forms of, quote, copying, end of quote, and, quote, imitating, end of quote. The vaniteux, vain person, cannot draw his desires from his own resources. He must borrow them from others. Thus, the vaniteux is brother to Don Quixote and Emma Bovary. And so in Stendhal, we again find triangular desire. In the first pages of The Red and the Black, we take a walk through Verrières with the mayor of the village and his wife, majestic but tormented, M. de Rene strolls along his retaining walls. He wants to make Julian Sorel the tutor of his two sons, but not for their sake, nor from love of knowledge. His desire is not spontaneous. The conversation between husband and wife soon reveals the mechanism. Quote, Valenod has no tutor for his children. He might very well steal this one from us, end of quote. Valenod is the richest and most influential man in Verrières, next to M. de Rene himself. The mayor of Verrières always has the image of his rival before his eyes during his negotiations with old M. Sorel. He makes the latter some very favorable propositions, but the sly peasant invents a brilliant reply. Quote, we have a better offer, end quote. This time, M. de Rene is completely convinced that Valenod wishes to engage Julian, and his own desire is redoubled. The ever-increasing price that the buyer is willing to pay is determined by the imaginary desire which he attributes to his rival. So there is indeed an imitation of this imaginary desire, and even a very scrupulous imitation, since everything about the desire which is copied, including its intensity, depends upon the desire which serves as model. At the end of the novel, Julian tries to win back Mathilde de la Mole, and on the advice of the dandy Korasoff, resorts to the same old trick as his father. He pays court to the Maréchal de Fervaques. He wishes to arouse this woman's desire and display it before Mathilde so that the idea of imitating it might suggest itself to her. A little water is enough to prime a pump. A little desire is enough to arouse desire in the creature of vanity. Julian carries out his plan and everything turns out as expected. The interest which the Maréchal takes in him reawakens Mathilde's desire, and the triangle reappears: Mathilde, Madame de Fervaques, Julian, M. de Rene, Valenod, Julian. The triangle is present each time that Stendhal speaks of vanity, whether it is a question of ambition, business, or love. It is surprising that the Marxist critics, for whom economic structures provide the archetype of all human relations, have not as yet pointed out the analogy between the crafty bargaining of old man Sorel and the amorous maneuvers of his son. A vaniteux will desire any object so long as he is convinced that it is already desired by another person whom he admires. The mediator here is a rival, brought into existence as a rival by vanity, and that same vanity demands his defeat. The rivalry between mediator and the person who desires constitutes an essential difference between this desire and that of Don Quixote or of Emma Bovary. Amadis cannot vie with Don Quixote in the protection of orphans in distress. He cannot slaughter giants in his place. Valenod, on the other hand, can steal the tutor from M. de Rene. The Maréchal de Fervaques can take Julian from Mathilde de la Mole. In most of Stendhal's desires, the mediator himself desires the object or could desire it. It is even this very desire, real or presumed, which makes this object infinitely desirable in the eyes of the subject. The mediation begets a second desire exactly the same as the mediator's. This means that one is always confronted with two competing desires. The mediator can no longer act his role of model without also acting or appearing to act the role of obstacle. Like the relentless sentry of the Kafka fable, the model shows his disciple the gate of paradise and forbids him to enter with one and the same gesture. We should not be surprised if the look cast by M. de Rene on Valenod is vastly different from that raised by Don Quixote toward Amadis.